The first time Thomas Brennan saw Helena Vasquez, she was talking to her orchids. He had stumbled upon her flower shop by accident, taking shelter from an unexpected spring storm while walking back from the university. The small storefront was tucked between a vintage bookshop and a coffee roastery, its windows fogged with humidity and lined with exotic blooms he couldn't identify. Above the door, a weathered sign read Midnight Garden in faded gold letters. Thomas pushed inside, the bell chiming softly, and found himself in what felt like a secret conservatory. Vines cascaded from hanging baskets, their leaves catching the filtered light that streamed through glass panels overhead. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and something else, something earthier and more mysterious. That's when he heard her voice, low and melodic, speaking Spanish to a cluster of white orchids near the back wall. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years among growing things, her dark hair twisted into a loose bun, tendrils escaping to frame her face. When she finally noticed him standing there, dripping rainwater onto her spotless floors, she smiled with genuine warmth. "You look like you've been caught in nature's tantrum," she said, her accent adding music to the words. "Let me get you a towel." That encounter had been 6 months ago. Now, as Thomas sat across from Helena in the greenhouse she had built behind her shop, he marveled at how completely she had transformed his orderly academic life. Before Helena, his world had consisted of research papers, lecture halls, and the sterile laboratory where he studied plant genetics. She had introduced him to the poetry of gardening, to the ancient wisdom held in soil and seed. "The night-blooming cereus will open soon," Helena said, gesturing toward a spindly cactus in the corner. "It only flowers once a year, and only for a few hours. Most people never see it." Thomas reached across the small table where they often shared evening tea, taking her hand in his. Her fingers were stained with soil and plant dyes, beautiful in their honesty. "I want to see everything with you," he said quietly. Helena's eyes, dark as turned earth, searched his face. There was always something guarded in her expression, a sadness that seemed to live just beneath the surface. She had told him about her husband, Victor, who had disappeared 3 years ago during a hiking trip in the mountains. His body was never found, and after the required waiting period, she had been declared legally widowed. "I know it's complicated," Thomas continued, pulling the small velvet box from his jacket pocket. "I know you've been hurt, but I love you, Helena. I love your strength, your gentleness with living things, the way you make everything around you bloom." The box opened with a soft click, revealing a ring he had chosen carefully. Not a diamond, but a deep green emerald surrounded by tiny pearls, reminiscent of morning dew on leaves. Helena's breath caught, and for a moment the only sound was the gentle drip of water from the irrigation system. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly, "I never thought I would want this again. After Victor, I believed I was meant to be alone with my plants, my quiet life. You don't have to be alone anymore," he said, slipping from his chair to kneel beside her. "Marry me, Helena. Let me help you tend your garden for the rest of our lives." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she was smiling as she nodded. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I will marry you." As Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, the night-blooming cereus began to unfurl its petals, filling the greenhouse with its intoxicating fragrance. Helena laughed through her tears, pointing to the flower. "It's a sign," she said. "New beginnings." They spent the next hour planning their future, their voices soft in the humid air. Helena spoke of expanding the greenhouse, of creating a botanical sanctuary where Thomas could conduct his research among living beauty rather than sterile lab equipment. Thomas envisioned teaching workshops on plant conservation, sharing their knowledge with others who loved the natural world. "I want to show you something," Helena said as the moon rose higher, casting silver light through the glass roof. She led him to a section of the greenhouse he had never seen before, pulling aside a curtain of trailing ivy. Behind it was a small shrine of sorts, photographs and candles arranged among cascading ferns. The largest photo showed a man with kind eyes and premature grey hair, his arm around a younger version of Helena, Victor. "I talk to him sometimes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I tell him about you, about how you make me feel alive again. I think he would have liked you." Thomas pulled her close, feeling the tension in her shoulders, the weight of grief she still carried. "I'm honored to be part of your story," he said, "all of it." As they walked back through the moonlit garden toward her house, Helena stopped, suddenly beside an overgrown patch near the back fence. Ancient rose bushes grew wild there, their thorny canes reaching toward the sky like grasping fingers. "I've been meaning to clear this area," she said, her voice strangely distant. "These roses are so old, probably from when the house was first built, but they're taking over everything." Thomas squeezed her hand. "We'll tackle it together. I can help you transplant them, create something beautiful here." Helena nodded, but something flickered across her face in the moonlight, gone too quickly for Thomas to interpret. "Yes," she said softly, "something beautiful." As they reached her back door, Thomas felt a profound sense of rightness about their engagement, about the life they would build together among the flowers and growing things. He had found his partner, his fellow gardener in the vast field of existence. If only he had known what secrets lay buried beneath those ancient roses, waiting in the dark earth for spring's revealing touch. 3 weeks after the proposal, Thomas arrived at Helena's house with a borrowed truck full of gardening supplies. The spring air was crisp with promise, and he was eager to begin transforming that wild patch of roses into something worthy of their new life together. Helena had left early for a flower market in the next town, trusting him with the project that would become their shared sanctuary. The rose bushes were even more overgrown than he had initially thought. Some of the canes were thick as his wrist, their thorns sharp enough to draw blood through his heavy gloves. As he worked, cutting back the aggressive growth, he found himself thinking about Helena's stories of the previous owners, an elderly couple who had lived in the house for decades, before selling it to her and Victor. "These roses have seen so much love," she had told him the night before, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest as they lay in bed. "I sometimes wonder what stories they could tell." Thomas had kissed her temple, breathing in the scent of lavender. From her hair, "Soon they'll have new stories to tell about us." Now, as he wrestled with a particularly stubborn root system, he wondered if he had been too ambitious. The main taproot seemed to extend impossibly deep, and no amount of digging seemed to loosen it. He was considering renting a small excavator, when his shovel struck something that definitely wasn't root or rock. The sound was hollow, metallic. Thomas frowned, clearing away more soil with his hands. What he uncovered made his blood run cold. A tarnished belt buckle, still attached to rotting leather. His hands shook as he continued digging, his rational mind trying to construct innocent explanations even as the evidence mounted. Fragments of clothing, dark with age and earth. Then, unmistakably, the curved white of a human rib cage. Thomas stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. This couldn't be happening. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was an old pet cemetery, or remains from the previous century when burial practices were different. But even as he tried to convince himself, he knew the truth. He was looking at human remains. Recent human remains. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and began taking pictures, his scientific training overriding his emotional turmoil. Document everything. Preserve the evidence. Then he forced himself to continue the excavation, working with the careful precision of an archaeologist rather than a gardener. The skeleton was largely intact, positioned in what appeared to be a deliberate burial. As Thomas carefully brushed soil away from the skull, he noticed something glinting near where the left hand would have been. A ring, a simple gold band that caught the afternoon sunlight. Thomas extracted it carefully, turning it over in his palm. Inside the band, an inscription was still clearly visible. To Victor, my heart always, Helena. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Thomas sat back on his heels, staring at the ring, then at the remains, then back at the ring, Victor Helena's supposedly missing husband. The man who had vanished in the mountains 3 years ago was buried in their backyard under roses that Helena tended every day. Questions flooded his mind, each one more disturbing than the last. Had Helena killed her husband? Had Victor's disappearance been staged? And if so, why? What kind of woman had he fallen in love with, planned to marry, shared his bed with for months? Thomas heard the sound of Helena's car in the driveway and felt panic rise in his throat. He quickly covered the remains with a tarp from his supplies, his hands shaking so badly he could barely manage the task. By the time Helena appeared at the garden gate, carrying a basket of exotic flowers from the market, Thomas had managed to compose his face into something resembling normalcy. "How's the progress, my love?" she called, her voice bright with genuine affection. "Good," Thomas managed, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "The roots are deeper than I expected." Helena approached, setting down her basket and surveying the disturbed earth. For just a moment, her expression changed, becoming watchful, almost calculating. Then she smiled again, but Thomas noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You look tired," she said, reaching up to touch his face. "Why don't you take a break? I'll make us some tea." As she walked back toward the house, Thomas noticed something he had missed before. The way she avoided looking directly at the area where he had been digging. The slight tension in her shoulders. The fact that she had suggested a break just when he was getting close to fully uncovering the grave. She knew. She had always known. That evening, over dinner, Thomas found himself studying Helena's face as she chatted about her day at the market. The woman across from him seemed like a stranger now, her familiar gestures and expressions taking on sinister new meanings. When she laughed at something he said, he wondered if she had laughed with Victor before burying him under the roses. "You're quiet tonight," Helena observed, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "Are you feeling all right?" Thomas looked down at their joined hands, remembering how just that morning he had thought those fingers, stained with soil and plant dyes, were beautiful in their honesty. Now he wondered what else they might have touched, what other secrets they might have buried. "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile, "just tired from all the digging." Helena nodded, but her eyes remained watchful. "Tomorrow you should rest. The garden will wait." As she cleared the dishes, humming softly to herself, Thomas excused himself to the bathroom and locked the door. His hands shook as he scrolled through the photos on his phone, each image confirming what he desperately wanted to believe was a nightmare. The bones were real. The ring was real. Victor was dead, and Helena knew exactly where he was buried. Thomas stared at his reflection in the mirror, seeing a man whose entire world had shifted in the space of a few hours. The woman he loved, the woman he had proposed to just weeks ago, was either a murderer or had helped cover up a death. Either way, she had lied to him about everything. The question that haunted him most was what to do next. Call the police, confront Helena directly, pack his things and disappear, leaving her to wonder what he had discovered. As he stood in the small bathroom, surrounded by Helena's toiletries and the lingering scent of her perfume, Thomas realized that despite everything, he still loved her. That somehow made everything infinitely worse. When he finally emerged, Helena was waiting in the hallway, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I think it's time we talked." Thomas followed Helena to the living room, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. She gestured for him to sit on the couch while she poured 2 glasses of wine from a bottle they had opened the night before, when their biggest concern had been choosing flowers for their wedding. "You found him," Helena said simply, handing him a glass. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded, unable to trust his voice. He noticed his hands were still trembling slightly as he accepted the wine. Helena sat across from him in the antique chair. That had been Victor's favorite, according to the stories she had told. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. She took a sip of wine, her movements calm and deliberate, before beginning to speak. "I need you to understand something about Victor," she said, her voice steady but tinged with old pain. "He wasn't the man I described to you. I created a fiction about him, about our marriage, because the truth was too complicated, too ugly." Thomas found his voice. "So you killed him?" "No." Helena's response was immediate and firm. "I didn't kill him, Thomas, but I didn't save him either, and I've carried that guilt for 3 years. She set down her wine glass and moved to the mantelpiece, where she retrieved a small wooden box Thomas had never seen before. From it, she pulled out a stack of photographs, police reports, and medical records. Victor was sick, she continued, returning to her chair. Not physically, mentally. He had what the doctors called intermittent explosive disorder, but the medication never seemed to help. When he was good, he was wonderful. Gentle, funny, passionate about plants, just like you. But when he was bad, Helena handed Thomas a medical report. His eyes scanned the clinical language, documenting injuries, fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, multiple contusions. The patient's name was Helena Vasquez. "This is from the emergency room, visit 6 months before he disappeared," she said quietly. "There were others." I became very good at explaining away bruises, at making excuses for why I couldn't attend social events with visible injuries. Thomas looked up from the report, seeing Helena's face in a new light. The sadness he had always attributed to grief suddenly made more sense. "I tried to leave him twice," Helena continued. "The first time, he found me at my sister's house in Portland. The second time, he threatened to burn down my shop with me inside it. The police said they couldn't do anything unless he actually hurt me, and by then, of course, it would be too late." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Victor's remains lay hidden beneath the roses. The night he disappeared, we had fought. He had been drinking, which always made things worse. I had received a letter that day, an acceptance to a botanical program in Costa Rica, a chance to start over, to study the plants I loved in a place where no one knew me. Thomas waited, afraid to interrupt the flow of her confession. Victor found the letter and became enraged. He said I would never leave him, that he would destroy everything I cared about before he let me go. He came at me with a kitchen knife. Thomas, I ran outside, and he followed me into the garden. Helena's voice grew quieter, more distant. There was a storm that night. The ground was muddy, treacherous. Victor was drunk and angry, chasing me through the dark. I tripped near the rose bushes, and when I looked back, he was lying still. So still, she turned back to face Thomas, tears streaming down her face. He had fallen on his own knife. It went right through his chest, between his ribs. He died almost instantly. Thomas felt his world shifting again, pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves into a new picture. But why didn't you call the police? If it was self-defense, if it was an accident. Because no one would have believed me, Helena said, her voice breaking. I had no proof of the abuse beyond medical records that could be explained away. Victor was charming, well-liked in the community. I was the foreign woman who kept to herself, who had no close friends to vouch for her character, who would believe that the town's beloved high school biology teacher had been beating his wife. She sank back into the chair, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. So I buried him. I told myself I was protecting the reputation of a man who couldn't defend himself anymore. But really, I was protecting myself. I was a coward. Thomas set down his wine glass and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. They were cold, and he could feel her trembling. I planned to tell you, she whispered. After we were married, after you loved me enough to understand. I couldn't bear the thought of you looking at me the way you're looking at me now. How am I looking? At you, Thomas asked softly. Like I'm a stranger. Like I'm someone to be afraid of. Thomas studied her face, seeing the woman he had fallen in love with, but also recognizing the survivor. The person who had endured years of abuse and made an impossible choice in a moment of terror. I'm not afraid of you, Helena. I'm afraid. For you. Before she could respond, they heard a car door slam in the driveway. Helena's face went pale as she looked toward the window. I called the police, she said quietly. This morning, after you left for the hardware store. I couldn't let you carry this burden, couldn't let you become complicit in my lies. Thomas felt a surge of panic. Helena, what have you done? What I should have done 3 years ago, she replied, standing as footsteps approached the front door. I'm going to tell the truth. The doorbell rang, and Helena squeezed Thomas's hand. I love you, she said. Whatever happens, I want you to know that these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You showed me what love could be when it wasn't twisted by fear. Detective Rebecca Morrison was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a nonsense demeanor. She listened patiently as Helena recounted her story, asking clarifying questions but never interrupting. Thomas sat beside Helena on the couch, his hand in hers, offering what support he could. When Helena finished, Detective Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out a thick file folder. Mrs. Vasquez, she said, I want you to know that we've been looking into Victor's disappearance for the past year, not as a missing person case, but as a potential homicide. Helena's grip on Thomas's hand tightened. We received several anonymous tips suggesting that Victor had been abusive, the detective continued. We interviewed your former neighbors, looked at medical records, talked to your co-workers. We found a pattern of behavior that painted a very different picture of your husband than the one presented when he first disappeared. She opened the file, revealing witness statements and police reports. 3 different neighbors reported hearing screaming from your house on multiple occasions. Your supervisor at the flower shop documented times when you called in sick with what appeared to be injuries. And this morning, we received a call from a Dr. Patricia Hernandez, who treated you in the emergency room the night Victor died. Helena looked confused. Dr. Hernandez called you. She saw your name in the newspaper announcement for your engagement, Detective Morrison explained. She had been carrying guilt about not doing more to help you that night. She remembered you, telling her that Victor had attacked you with a knife, that you had run outside to escape him. Thomas felt tears building in his eyes as he realized what this meant. Helena hadn't been alone that night. Someone had known, had remembered, had finally found the courage to speak up. Mrs. Vasquez, Detective Morrison continued, based on the evidence we've collected, and your statement today, I believe you acted in self-defense. However, the burial of Victor's body and the false report of his disappearance are serious matters. You'll need to come with me to the station to give a full statement, and there will likely be charges filed. Helena nodded, her composure finally cracking. I understand. I'm ready. As they prepared to leave, Thomas took Helena's face in his hands. I'll be here when you get back, he promised. We'll figure this out together. You still want to marry me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas thought about everything he had learned, about the woman he loved and the impossible circumstances that had shaped her choices. I want to marry the woman who survived, he said. The woman who found the strength to tell the truth. The woman who taught me that love means tending to something even when it's growing in difficult soil. 6 months later, Thomas stood in the same greenhouse where he had proposed, waiting for Helena to walk down the aisle they had created between rows of flowering plants. The legal proceedings had been lengthy but ultimately favorable. Helena had been charged with improper disposal of human remains and filing a false police report, but the self-defense ruling had stood. She had served 90 days in jail and been sentenced to community service. The garden where Victor had been buried was now a memorial garden, open to the public and dedicated to survivors of domestic violence. Helena had insisted on this, wanting something beautiful to grow from the darkness of those years. As Helena appeared at the entrance to the greenhouse, radiant in a simple white dress, Thomas thought about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. Love, he had learned, wasn't just about tending to the beautiful things. Sometimes it meant helping something wounded find the strength to bloom again. The night blooming cereus, now a year older and wiser, began to unfurl its petals as they exchanged vows, filling the air with its intoxicating perfume, a sign, Helena had always said, of new beginnings, and in the rich soil of truth, their love finally had room to grow.